It started with a silence that didn't belong on morning television. Not the kind of silence that comes between questions. Not the polished pause producers insert for drama or timing. This was the kind of silence that grows in a room when something's off, when everyone senses it, but no one can name it yet. And sitting in the middle of that tension, wearing his aged-like armor and his legacy like a loaded weapon, was Clint Eastwood. His eyes, those infamous pale blue eyes that once froze. Outlaws and generals on the big screen were scanning the set like a sniper picking targets. And though he was 94 years old, no one watching Good Morning America that morning would have dared to underestimate him. The legend had returned, and something told you this wasn't going to be routine. George Stephanopoulos smiled for the cameras. The kind of practiced, media-trained grin that says welcome but rarely means it. He leaned in, fingertips on cue cards that had already been ignored. "Clint," he said with warmth as artificial as the lights above them. "Thank you for joining us this morning." "Morning," Clint replied, his voice gravel-thick and unshaken, like it had been dragged across 1,000 movie reels and still refused to crack. He didn't smile. He didn't shift in his seat. He just sat there waiting. The first few minutes went as expected, the usual promotional dance. A brief reel of Eastwood's latest film flickered across the screen's subtle piano, underscoring dramatic voiceover. Slow dissolves between shots of sunsets, grit, and justice. A role built for him, or perhaps one that had waited decades for him to play it. George asked about directing at 94, about legacy. "About inspiration," Clint answered with precision. "No rambling, no grandstanding, just clarity and calm. The way a man speaks when he's been carrying the weight of his name for over half a century, and then it shifted like a shadow that creeps, just slightly faster than it should." "But Clint," George said, that smile curdling just a touch, "you've seen Hollywood evolve. You've seen the push for more diverse voices. Some people would say finally, others not so much. Where do you land?" Eastwood's eyes narrowed, barely. The kind of movement that would have passed unnoticed if you didn't know what to look for. But for those who did, it was clear that wasn't a question. That was a trigger. "Well, George," Clint began, slowly, "I think good stories are good stories, doesn't matter who tells them." George didn't blink. "But surely you acknowledge that the industry needed to change." The tension rippled through the studio like heat off pavement. You could feel it from the audience, the collective shift in posture. They held breath. They came expecting charm. They were getting fire. Clint's jaw set. "I believe in hiring the best person for the job, period. But history shows that best person usually meant one type of person." George pressed, voice tightening. "And that type looked a lot like you." There it was. Not a question, not even a veiled critique. It was a line drawn in sand. Eastwood adjusted the cuff of his jacket, slowly, deliberately, as if buying time for the audience to brace themselves. "Privilege." He said, "Finally, son, I grew up during the Depression. I worked in steel mills, dug holes in the ground for $1 a day. I didn't come into this industry through a revolving door. I busted it down." George nodded, feigning agreement, but his voice betrayed him. "But Clint, your generation had opportunities others didn't. The old boys, network. Gatekeeping. Surely you see how that affected who got through the door and who didn't." And just like that, the switch flipped. Eastwood didn't shout. He didn't raise his hand. He simply leaned forward like a storm cloud rolling off a mountain and fixed George with a stare so hard it felt like the lights dimmed. "To talk about doors," Clint said, voice low and cracking with heat. "I spent a decade getting rejected, playing background parts, getting laughed out of offices. No handouts, no favors, and certainly no damn network pulling strings for me." In the control room, producers exchanged frantic glances. One reached for the commercial button. The director slapped his hand away. "Keep rolling, but you had advantages." George pushed, almost breathless now. "The system was built for men like you." Clint's eyes sharpened like gunmetal. "Men like me. Yes, white, male, straight, conservative." "Stop. One word, one syllable." The room froze. "George," Clint said, standing up slowly, his shadow stretching across the interview desk, "you invited me here to talk about my movie. Instead, you're trying to make me your punching bag for every damn thing you think is wrong with this country." "I'm trying to have an honest conversation," George replied, squirming now, his smile gone. his composure unraveling. "No, you're trying to create a moment," Clint growled. "Something you can clip, something you can tweet. You brought me here under false pretenses, and now you want to put me on trial." Audience members started murmuring. A woman in the front row put a hand to her mouth. One of the camera operators whispered, "Is this real?" George straightened his shoulders. "Clint, this isn't an ambush. It's accountability." "Accountability?" Clint laughed once. Dry, hard. "You think I owe you an apology for a lifetime of work that people loved, that moved them, that meant something? You don't think your films perpetuated certain problematic views?" George asked, reaching now, flailing beneath that anchor desk. Clint stepped around the chair and stood over him, not aggressive, but unmistakably in control. "Define problematic?" he challenged. George hesitated. "Hypermasculinity, violence, one-sided narratives." "You ever see $1 Million Baby?" Clint asked. "Gran Torino? Letters from Iwo Jima?" "Exceptions," George replied quickly. "Not the rule. And that right there," Clint said, pointing at him, "is the problem. You don't watch movies. You watch agendas." The audience broke soft gasps, a smattering of claps. A tension that was no longer ignorable. George, flushed now, leaned back. "Clint, I think you're being defensive." "I'm being honest," Eastwood shot back, "something this show seems to have forgotten how to handle." "Clint, I made art," Eastwood cut in. "For people who work real jobs, live real lives, face real problems. Not for critics who call everything problematic because it doesn't flatter their worldview." George looked around, desperate. His control was gone. All he had left was the chair beneath him and a studio full of people who weren't sure if they were witnessing history or a career implosion or both. "I think your era is over," George said finally, his voice dropping to something cold. "Maybe it's time you admit that." Clint paused, looked at him, not with anger, but with something quieter, sadder. "Son," he said, voice heavy with finality, "my era built the one you're standing in." He turned to the camera, addressing not George, not the audience, but America itself. "You see what they do now?" he said, eyes burning with a calm fury. "They don't want to learn from you. They want to erase you. Replace your story with one that makes them feel better. Safer, smarter, but real. Stories, true stories, aren't supposed to make you feel comfortable. They're supposed to make you feel something." He began unclipping his mic. The studio scrambled. Someone yelled into a headset. A stage manager stepped forward, then stopped short. No one wanted to be the one to try and stop Clint Eastwood. George finally found his voice. "Clint, we're not finished." Clint's eyes never moved. "Oh, we are." He placed the mic on the chair, turned to the audience, and nodded once like a general dismissing his troops. And then he walked off the set, slow, measured, with all the dignity of a man who's walked away from harder fights and bigger fires. Behind him, George sat alone, red-faced, breathless, and drowning in silence, and the cameras kept rolling. George Stephanopoulos shifted in his chair. The silence after Clint Eastwood's defiant stand wasn't just awkward, it was radioactive. The audience held its breath, caught in the tension between two men from vastly different Americas. Gaze hadn't budged. Neither had his jaw. His hands rested on his knees like iron weights. George tried to reset. So he began, voice thinning, "You don't think there's a line between legacy and accountability?" Clint blinked. "Slow. You mean your line?" George faltered. Clint leaned forward slightly, not aggressively, but with the calm weight of a man who'd been underestimated one too many times. "You've spent the last 10 minutes trying to script my life into your version of regret. You want me to apologize for surviving an era you could never stomach. You were part of a system George tried, but Clint cut him off. So were you." Clint said sharply, his voice low but sharp enough to cut glass, "You just wear nicer suits." The crowd stirred. A few nervous chuckles escaped, but most remained in dead silence. The studio had become something more dangerous than entertainment. It had become honest. George glanced toward the producers behind the cameras, silently begging for some kind of cue. None came. This wasn't the segment they'd planned. This wasn't the Clint Eastwood they'd prepped for. This was raw. This was unscripted. This was television on the edge of detonation. Clint turned his gaze outward, beyond George, addressing the audience. No, the country. Every decade, the rules change. And every time, someone like you shows up, looking backwards, pretending they would have done it all better. But where were you when the bullets flew, and no one gave a damn whether the smoke cleared? George tried again, firmer now. Clint, we're not talking about combat. We're talking about the way voices like yours shaped the culture, the damage it left behind. You think Dirty Harry caused damage? Clint said, voice tinged with incredulity. You think the man with the badge is the problem? Not the coward behind the desk who won't make the hard call? That line landed like a gut punch. A woman in the front row visibly exhaled, as though she'd been holding it in since the interview started. Someone else muttered "wow" under their breath. You could feel the tremble beneath the seats, the realization that something historic was happening here. George steadied himself. I'm saying there's a responsibility that comes with influence, and you've had decades of it. And I used it, Clint snapped. To speak for people no one wanted to hear. The silent ones. The ones who kept this country alive while you wrote stories about what it should have been. Isn't that exactly the issue? George fired back. You made heroes out of violence, out of silence, out of solitude. Isn't that the myth? You sold? Clint stared at him. Better than selling comfort in chaos, the words hit like gravel being poured onto marble. It wasn't just a disagreement now. It was a collision of ideologies, of worldviews shaped by different wars, different values, different versions of American truth. The crew behind the cameras stopped moving. Even the stage manager, who usually mouthed countdowns and commercial cues, was frozen. This wasn't broadcast anymore. This was confession. Clint finally leaned back in his chair, shoulders relaxing, as if the burden wasn't his anymore. You want to cancel a generation? He said quietly. Because it makes you feel clean. But life ain't clean, son. Muddy. And if you don't get your hands dirty once in a while, you're not living. You're just talking. George blinked, and for a second, just a fraction, you saw doubt flicker in his eyes. Not because Clint was right, but because Clint was certain. A producer finally whispered something into George's earpiece, a desperate plea to move things forward. But it was too late. Clint turned his head, looking straight into the camera lens, past the walls of the studio and into the homes of millions. You don't get to erase people, he said, not just because they scare you. Then silence. And this time, George didn't try to fill it. The show cut to commercial, but not before the room erupted. Not with applause, not with boos, just stunned, rattled, human sound. The commercials rolled, but no one on set moved. George sat frozen, eyes locked on the blank cue cards in front of him. Their carefully curated questions, now useless, Ash. Clint didn't look at him, didn't need to. He just sat there breathing, steady, like he had nothing left to prove. Like the war was over and he'd already won. The stage lights dimmed slightly, a failed attempt to reset the atmosphere. But the damage or revelation, depending on your view, had already detonated. The makeup artist hovered nearby, unsure whether to approach George, who now looked less like a host and more like a man who'd been hit by a train of reality he never saw coming. A production assistant whispered, "Back in 5. Her voice trembled. George nodded absent lie, .4.3.2.1. And the feed returned live. But something had shifted. The glossy, rehearsed cheer of morning television had drained out of the room. Even the iconic Good Morning America jingle felt hollow now. Clint sat unbothered. George, attempting to recalibrate, offered a breathy, almost forced smile. To the camera, "We're back," he said, voice brittle. If you're just joining us, we're in the middle of a passionate conversation with legendary filmmaker Clint Eastwood. Clint didn't blink. It's not passion, George. It's truth. The air cracked again. George tried to reframe. Look, I didn't invite you here to tear you down, no. Clint arched a brow. Then why'd you come at me with 30-year-old headlines before you even asked me a single damn question about the work I'm doing now? I was setting context, George insisted. People deserve context. You mean ammunition? Clint said flatly. You're not interviewing me. You're prosecuting me, and I'm not on trial. The audience, clearly divided now, murmured again. Some nodded in agreement with Clint's straight-shooting defiance. Others winced, unsure whether they were Witnessing justice being evaded or truth being wielded, Clint leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. You want to talk about my past? Fine, but let's talk about all of it, not just the parts that fit your headline. Let's talk about the films I made when no one would touch veterans, the stories I told when studios said America wasn't ready. You want controversy? You're looking at a man who stared it in the face and filmed it anyway. George tried to interrupt, but Clint rolled on. Gran Torino, Clint continued. You called it racially insensitive, but you didn't talk about what it meant to the Hmong community to be seen for the first time on a screen that big. You called American Sniper propaganda, but you didn't sit with the families who told me it gave their grief a name. George finally cut in, firmer now. But there are critiques, Clint, serious ones. People who feel you glorify violence, who say you lean into old, outdated archetypes. Clint smiled coldly. You mean masculinity? George hesitated. I mean, a kind of masculinity that can be toxic. And that was the spark. Clint stood. Not in anger, but clarity. The camera instinctively pulled back, capturing his full frame. He towered now, not just in presence, but in purpose. Toxic masculinity, he repeated, almost to himself. That's your phrase for men who don't fold, for fathers who show up, for builders, fighters, protectors. You want softness in every corner of this world, and when it doesn't show up, you call it dangerous. You think that's what we're doing? George asked, stunned. I think you've confused strength with threat, Clint replied. And I think you've spent so long trying to make everything safe, you forgot that some things are supposed to be hard. The silence that followed wasn't dead. It was heavy. Alive. George stared up at him. So you think we should just ignore evolution? Not question what we pass down? No, Clint said simply. I think you asked the question, but you don't come into that question with a loaded gun. The crew didn't even bother counting down to commercial this time. The camera faded to black, and still, the tension remained. In the shadows off stage, a junior producer dropped her headset onto the desk, eyes wide. What the hell just happened? Nobody answered Dot, because nobody knew, and Clint, he just stood backstage, sipping water, like nothing had happened at all, because for him, it hadn't. It was just another morning, another fight, another war survived. The final segment was supposed to be fluff, a soft goodbye, a mutual thank you, maybe even a laugh or two to smooth over the barbed wire tension that had sliced through the last hour. But when the cameras came back, something was different. George was quieter, paler. His suit looked like it was wearing him now. He shuffled the cue cards in his hand, but they meant nothing anymore. The control was gone, not taken, not stolen, just ... dismantled, brick by brick, word by word, until all that was left was a man trying to outrun a mirror. Clint sat back in the chair like a monument. He didn't lean in this time, didn't press. He didn't need to. His presence alone now did what 1,000 interviews couldn't. It made the room honest. George finally cleared his throat. Clint, he said, his voice softer, more human, you've made a career out of challenging people, institutions, expectations. Some say you've challenged accountability. Others say you've challenged censorship. After today, what do you think you've really stood for? Clint didn't answer right away. He looked out, not at George, not at the camera, something older than the lights and the scripts, and the endless loop of celebrity redemption arcs. Then he turned back, eyes locked. I've stood for the idea, he said, that people aren't perfect, and that's okay, that men can be broken and still be useful. That mistakes don't erase meaning. You all want saints now. I never played saints. I played men who looked in the mirror and saw scars, and still went out the door. The studio was silent. Not even the crew moved. George leaned back, letting those words settle. But don't you ever feel, he asked, that by refusing to apologize, at least publicly, you're telling people their pain doesn't matter? Clint breathed in slow, then exhaled. I think people want apologies not for healing, he said, but for ownership, for power. They want you on your knees so they can feel taller. But I don't kneel unless it's real, and I don't perform regret for ratings. A sharp intake of breath echoed from someone off camera. Forgive you, he asked. Clint looked straight into the lens now, like he was staring into every living room in America. Then they never knew who I was to begin with. Another silence, this one vast. George glanced toward the director's booth. The signal for wrap was blinking red. They had 60 seconds left, but instead of cutting to promo footage or rolling a clip from Clint's film, George leaned forward. "Matter what people think about this interview," he said. "You were honest." Clint smirked. "That's the one thing I've never had trouble being." George hesitated. Then, almost too quietly, he said, "Do you ever regret not staying quiet?" Clint turned his head, just slightly. "No," he said, "because silence would have been easier. And if I've learned anything, it's that easy is never what makes you who you are." The director mouthed, 10 seconds. George turned to the camera, visibly shaken but somehow lighter, like something sacred and heavy had finally been dragged into the light. He began his usual sign-off. "We'll be right back after," but Clint cut in. "One more thing." George paused. Clint turned back to him, not as an actor or a guest, but as a man staring across a divide that had defined two different Americas. "You asked what I stand for? I stand for people not being afraid to say the thing, even if they lose the room." George didn't speak. He couldn't. The camera operator's hand trembled. The screen froze. Clint's face the last image captured. Then the broadcast cut. Phones across the country exploded. Twitter imploded. Cable news anchors scrambled for footage. The View producers began prepping emergency roundtables. Hashtags collided. Think pieces were halfway written by the time Clint's car pulled out of the GMA lot, and George, he sat alone in the dressing room. The silence, now a living thing pressing against the walls. He watched the footage back, not the questions, not the sound bites, just the moment Clint looked him in the eyes and refused to flinch. It wasn't just an interview, it was a reckoning. And the world, used to apologies and spin and artificial confrontation, didn't know what to do with a man who simply told the truth and walked out standing. Clint Eastwood didn't change history that morning. He reminded it what it looked like, what it sounded like, and maybe, just maybe, what it still had the courage to be. So when people say they saw something different that day, they're right. It wasn't a breakdown. It wasn't a meltdown. It was a confrontation of myth versus mandat, of comfort versus consequence, and of a country still struggling to decide whether truth is dangerous or just inconvenient. Clint didn't care either way. He'd said what needed saying, and then, just like he always has, he let the silence speak for him.